Hi everyone, I'm Julia, welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to talk about the new Bandersnatch, so let's just dive right into it.
You Bander what?
Bandersnatch.
The new Black Mirror's Bandersnatch is labeled as an event, but it feels more like an innovative experience that can be placed between a movie and a video game, which is fitting considering that Stefan is an ambitious young programmer that wants to turn an adventure novel in a game. It's set in the 80s, and for once the retro nostalgia that has been so overused lately by any form of entertainment serves to the actual plot, specifically to one of the possible endings. I originally thought of approaching the different choices in a methodical way, starting off with all the choices that I thought were absolutely right, so not to metaphorically get a game over, then picking a different choice for every single decision and see how it changed the storyline. However, pretty early on, Black Mirror sets a trap. First, it lulls you into a false sense of security by asking a series of placebo options, like what Stefan should eat for breakfast or what music should he listens to. But then another choice that seems safe turns out to be the first radical decision that truly starts setting up the breaking point of Bandersnatch.
Sorry, mate. Wrong path.
I'm pretty positive that about 90% of the users chose to accept the offer proposed because it was the most logical one. To refuse the proposal to work at Tuckersoft with the infamous Colin Ritman would mean game over, right? Black Mirror purposely sets up the trap to rewind the story from the beginning, as if you'd lost a life in a game, exactly to show you how the characters instinctively remember or understand something they missed before. For example, Stefan also knows that a game stopped working because of a buffer error, something that in the previous timeline Colin said and Stefan was unaware of. This is the way in which Bandersnatch makes us understand how every time we repeat the story, the characters increasingly become more knowledgeable.
We've met before.
No.
So much so that Stefan eventually realizes that somehow, something or someone is pushing him towards a decision over another. That's us, and he tries to fight it.
I don't know where it came from. I just said no, and then I had to justify it by saying that I preferred to work alone. I just don't know where the urge to say it came from.
This is the biggest but somehow predictable ending that makes Stefan aware of a futuristic Netflix service that lets humans of the future dictate his decisions.
What the fuck is Netflix? Seriously, what does that mean?
Another possible ending, less meta and more sci-fi orientated, still works with the original narrative of a controlling entity, in this case the father that was part of the PAC, acronym for Program and Control Study.
You weren't supposed to know.
Dad, what is this?
Sorry.
Dad, who are you?
This ending ties the storyline of the past much better with mirrors, in a similar Videodrome fashion that allows Stefan to travel through time. By doing so, we see how Stefan's dad, and possibly everyone else he ever trusted since he was a little child, has used him for experiments on the effects of trauma. Some of the decisions that I found impact the storyline the most are: when you're faced to either follow Colin or go to the therapist. Although the latter is the right choice for continuing the story and avoid the game over, the most relevant one is indeed choosing to follow Colin, because once you do, you get into the most narrative-filled part of Bandersnatch, and to me one of the most enjoyable parts of the whole experience. Because although there are some wrong answers, this often leads you to understand better the characters or the whole story. Here Colin talks to us for the first time about parallel realities, the illusion of free will, and plays on the metaphor of the game Pac-Man.
Do you know what PAC stands for? PAC. Program and Control. He's Program and Control Man.
The whole thing's a metaphor. He thinks he's got free will, but really, he's trapped in a maze, in a system. All he can do is consume. He's pursued by demons that are probably just in his own head. And even if he does manage to escape by slipping out one side of the maze, what happens? He comes right back in the other side.
Bandersnatch mirrors this. Every time we come across a game over of sorts and are forced back to the previous choice, Pac-Man's maze comes in effect. If you try to leave by destroying the computer, for example, you are immediately thrown back in the game. After these revelations, we are faced with two final dead ends where either Colin or Stefan jump off a balcony and die. Once that's over with, we are again redirected to the therapist. The second most impactful decision is when you have to enter the passcode for the save. If you choose JFD, you'll see a ghost of the death author. PAC allows Stefan to discover the monitoring program. PAX makes you see the demon of the book. And Toy lets Stefan go back in time, altering history and dying in the train with his mother. Possibly one of the happiest endings out of them all, which is saying a lot about the others. Another relevant decision for the storyline is that if you don't properly dial the therapist's number after murdering Stefan's dad, so that either Stefan's boss or Colin will show up at the house, you can choose to kill either of them, and that means Stefan obviously end up to jail. And finally, another crucial situation is about deciding what to say to Stefan when he asks for a sign. The Netflix choice can result in Stefan attacking the therapist.
How's that for entertainment, you psychiatric fuck? Huh? Fuck your day, I'm good and proper, anyway. Me and my friend from the future.
Or in a super meta way, you may discover that you're an actor on the set of a show.
You're not scripted to jump out, see, Mike? It's the fight scene now. Mike? Mike?
Stefan.
Do you want to sit down for a moment?
The glyph path leads you to kill Stefan's father, although you can choose whether to bury him or cut him up. If you go through the last option, you may find a more gratifying ending, game-wise, as Stefan isn't immediately accused for the murder of the father, leading to Bandersnatch being produced and receiving 5 stars rating. Whether pretty much all the other options lead to either Bandersnatch being butchered by critics or never hitting the shelves to begin with. Stefan will eventually be found guilty of the murder and sent to jail, but in the final credits, we find out that Colin's daughter, Pearl, is adapting the game for Netflix, which is what we're playing to begin with. The most relevant insight from Bandersnatch is that there is no happy ending as typical of Black Mirror, because Bandersnatch is meta even in its deepest meaning, which is that although there may be endless possibilities, our choices are not necessarily dictated by free will. As the users of Bandersnatch, we may look as if we are in control, but we're actually guided to a series of predetermined outcomes. While when we choose what appears to be a different option but end up in the same old loops, certainly reads as a metaphor of how we tend to repeat the same actions, hoping for a different outcome in real life. It is also interesting to see how Bandersnatch inverts Black Mirror's typical formula. Usually in the show, it's the technology that controls humans. In this case, it's us that become the puppeteer. All in all, the whole experience was quite pleasant despite the bleak solutions I may end up with, because it definitely feels like an innovative puzzle to solve, but it definitely reads more like a game than a movie. The underlying concept and possible pathways are not particularly original. It is all stuff that other shows and movies have explored ad nauseum before in the sci-fi/futuristic genre and in much better depth. So narrative-wise, it's not even remotely close to Black Mirror's highest standards, but as an experiment, it definitely pushes and expands the limits of what we consider entertainment, and it will definitely keep people engaged for some time. Sometimes it does lose Black Mirror's cleverness in the sense that, probably because of its new format, leads the audience too much towards either the right answers or understanding why they're wrong. For example, when we need to choose whether to open up with the therapist regarding Stefan's past and the death of his mother Rather, the doctor keeps telling us that it may be important to talk about it, so to know more about ourselves, aka choose to make Stefan talk so you can understand the narrative better, and even if you continuously try to avoid it, in the end you're kind of forced into choosing to talk about it. Because if you don't have Stefan recounted the trauma of his childhood, then all the consequent pathways won't make sense. However, other more subtle Easter eggs and clues are definitely in line with Black Mirror's usual self-awareness. For example, Colin repeatedly tells Stefan that he's in the hole, and we know that the toy rabbit is an important element of the whole backstory. Both connect going down the rabbit hole, a clear reference to Alice in Wonderland, where the name Bandersnatch originally comes from. Likewise, in the beginning, Stefan's father comments that the neighbor's dog will be the death of him, and in one of the endings is indeed the dog that discovers his buried body. Some other nice touches that change according to your decisions make the story more immersive. For example, according to which band you choose in the beginning, either Thompson Twins or Now 2, Stefan will mention it when asked about what music he likes by Colin. Likewise, according to which cereals you choose, either Sugar Puffs or Frosties, you'll see an advert for that same brand of cereal later on. One of the most interesting things that I have realized about Bandersnatch is that the audience, purpose changes continuously. At first, probably everyone's purpose is to help Stefan write and produce the game successfully. But then, as we are faced with so many different choices and become more aware of the mechanics of Bandersnatch, we lose sight of our initial purpose because each decision effectively impacts some other aspect of the story. Do we care more about Stefan's well-being, or do we try to keep forwarding the story for our own entertainment despite this may hurt Stefan? Not only the choices, but most importantly, our decision-making processes vary greatly, distracting us from the initial collective objective we all set up to achieve. Pretty much just like in life. That's why, in general, the hard endings are not that many. The multitude doesn't lay in the final act, but in the different ways in which we end up there. The slight differences and soft endings we encounter throughout Bandersnatch instead are far more difficult to quantify, and those are what makes Bandersnatch most interesting.
I should try again.
Stefan.
I'm trying again.